Professor Brown, thanks a lot for coming on and doing this with me. I've been looking forward to this one for a while.
Absolutely, should be fun.
So, you have some very interesting thoughts about UFOs and the possibility of aliens, on Earth, given recent things that have happened. You've put out a couple of talks talking about some of the stuff in the U.S. government and then some of the stuff with the Nazca mummies hearings. You mentioned that you weren't that interested in the topic up until around the summer, and then you got more interested in it and you did the talks and stuff. Given, that there's this long history going back to the 50s of...
We should also talk. There's a frog in my office that if you occasionally hear it chirping, it's a frog.
Sometimes he chimes in. But there's been a pretty substantial history going back to around 47 up until now of the U.S. government getting involved in UFO sightings and cases, military officers having sightings, sightings at nuclear facilities, all this kind of stuff. And then we're going into the 2000s. We have the Tic Tac, we have Gimbal, Go Fast. And then Grush comes forward with some pretty interesting claims. The premise, it seemed like in the first talk, was it's newly rational to believe in the possibility of UFOs and aliens on Earth. Well, not UFOs, but extraterrestrial objects on Earth, aliens on Earth. What, I guess, kind of took you down this rabbit hole, and what was the tipping point for you to make the claim that it's now newly rational to believe in these things?
Yeah, good. So I think Grush was the tipping point, right? So as you say, there's been, at least since the 1940s, a lot of people, pretty smart people, pretty credentialed people, who have been saying there's weird stuff going on in the sky, there's stuff the government is hiding from us. There's frogs in my office. There's reverse engineering programs going on. This is part of the explanation of our success in technological innovation over the past century. People have been saying that for decades, but mostly they've been saying it in the context of, hey, I'm at the end of my career, or I'm toward the end of my life, I'm talking to a journalist, and I'm publishing a book, or I'm going on a TV show, or I'm going on the circuit of UFO-friendly conferences, or something like that. The thing that Grush did that made such a big difference is he utilized the whistleblower protocols that the government had set up for these reasons, and was testifying under oath in legally significant contexts, right? So he's essentially accusing certain specific individuals and groups of people within and around the government of a crime.
Yeah.
And so that means that there's a level of risk involved in him doing that, cost to him involved in him doing that, that's different than we've seen before, right?
Yeah.
You make a book about UFOs and you're lying, then there's essentially no consequences for that, and you could imagine the better the lie, the better the sales, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you're testifying before the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community that someone's committing a crime, then you'd better not be lying, right? And you'd better have you better have the proof. And allegedly he does. And we can tell, not because the public has seen it, because the public hasn't seen it, but we can tell that there's something really substantial going on because of the way that the people who can see it are reacting. So
right.
If you look at what the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community is doing, he's been stated that, or he's on the record as stating that Grush's claims are credible and urgent. Grush's lawyer at this point was the previous Inspector General of the Intelligence Community, who left his law firm to continue representing Grush after Grush left the government. We've seen members of the Senate and the House Intelligence committees, which have the classified access to see what Grush has been talking about, acting very weirdly, saying that they're taking Grush very seriously, saying that they're looking into it, passing the UAP Disclosure Act, like. So that's the kind of stuff that I think is new, where we can kind of peek behind the curtains a little bit at what's going on behind the scenes. We can't see it directly, but we can see it indirectly, right? Like we have members of Congress saying, we've seen high-res videos and high-res photos that have not been released to the public. We've been briefed in ways that we cannot tell you about, but it's serious business, and that's what's new.
So where's that going now?
There's a lot going on right now. There essentially there's this UAP Disclosure Act that it was an amendment to some kind of bigger bill. Like, I don't understand politics very well, right?
Me neither.
Like it's a rider on some other bill. And once that bigger bill passes, then it will kick into effect. And I don't even really understand what it's riding on and when that passes. From what I understand, it hasn't. The thing it's piggybacking on hasn't passed yet. Because once it does kick in, the way it's written, I think it's 90 days. Within 90 days, the Biden has the responsibility to put together an independent review board. From people outside of the military government world, academics of various kinds with certain kinds of credentials to evaluate what's going on and make a plan for disclosing some of it to the public. There's all kinds of stuff written in there about like trying to kind of go after these military contracting companies that seem to have, or according to Grush and others who Grush is allegedly kind of speaking on behalf of, that they have these resources that have kind of been squirreled away outside of government oversight, and so the UAP Disclosure Act is written to target those specific things and kind of get around the mechanisms that have not allowed them to stay hidden. So all of that could happen within the next year, right?
Yeah.
Like 2024 promises to be the year where something pretty significant happens as far as getting access to this information and making at least some of it public.
Yeah. So some of that is going to include like in the hearing. One of the things that tortured the people interested in this was he kept saying like, I can't talk about X,
Yes.
Y, and Z unless like we have meetings with people with the proper clearances. So one of the steps that they're taking is like having those meetings and setting those things up. Has there been a development on any more of those happening?
Yeah, so Grush, I think it was the House passed something. So there's been these shenanigans that the Department of Defense kind of got rid of Grush's security clearance for some reason, and so Grush can't actually go into the secure context right now. So there was some bill passed that's trying to advocate for him to get his security clearance back, and but there's a number of layers of this going on, right? Because that's like the House Oversight Committee, which like the people on the Oversight Committee don't have the clearances that say the people in the Intelligence Committee do.
Yeah.
So the House and Senate Intelligence Committees have already gotten access to what happened with Grush. The Inspector General of the Intelligence Community already has access. So there are parties in Congress and in the kind of intelligence community oversight powers that be who already have what Grush is saying, right? It's more that some kind of noisier, more public-friendly members of Congress want to get access to it so they can talk about it more.
Right.
And that's the part that's being tripped up. So so it's important to realize if you're tracking these things that there are kind of several layers of things that are happening in the government right now. And clearly, for instance, the executive branch knows way more than anybody is being let in on. The Department of Defense knows way more than what's being released to the public. So, there's weird things behind the scenes that you can kind of infer, like Chuck Schumer, because it was Schumer that put together the UAP Disclosure Act. Like Schumer's on the record as saying that he talked to the president, or maybe not the president, but to the White House about this, and the White House kind of knows and isn't going to oppose. And so there's all this behind the scenes politicking going on that you can kind of see indirectly as an ordinary civilian. But that we kind of have to read between the lines because nothing has been just outright stated. And one of the things that Grush is doing right now is just making a lot of noise about, like, hey, Biden, or whoever the president ends up being, like, you should really talk about this to the public. It would be better, says somebody like Grush, if I didn't have to say anything, or if Congress didn't have to uncover something, but if the executive would take the White House would take the leadership on this, and it isn't, which is lots of interesting questions to ask. But one of the questions to ask is why, at this point, as it seems more and more obvious that something is up, and that things are being hidden, why isn't it in the interests of the White House to take the lead on this? Because it seems like it should be. I've been kind of surprised, given how much stuff has been coming out, that the White House isn't taking more leadership.
So at this point, we're kind of just like waiting to see how the all the gears in the machine kind of start to work this out.
That's
and
right.
Get things uncovered. So that's one of the things that made me interested in your views, because it seemed like the popular perspective with this is just kind of like the interested agnostic.
Yeah.
Where it's like, let's wait and find out. You took the extra leap to say it's rational to have an active belief in these things.
Yeah.
What kind of led you to that thinking? Like where did you go after the hearings? Like what kind of digging?
Yeah, good. So I think. So I'm inclined to think that we have a long series of events that satisfy certain conditions, right? These kind of multiple witness, multiple sensor situations. The clearest of which is the Nimitz David Fravor encounter with the Tic Tac, where we have multiple Navy ships picking up radar signatures, sending out multiple Navy planes who are seeing something, with multiple Navy pilots and weapons operators simultaneously visually observing it, and then we have a video. Like that's the gold standard case of the kind of clearest evidence that we have that there are in fact these craft with very unusual features, these anti-gravity, instantaneous acceleration, hypervelocity kinds of craft. That I think we can, if you look just at the Nimitz case, it should be clear that this is not a weather balloon, this is not a hallucination, it's an anti-gravity craft. The way that it behaves, it turns and engages and like spirals around and then flies off. Like the fact that it turns to engage, it shows some kind of intelligent behavior. So it just seems like the gold standard case. Like I think if you look at the Nimitz case, you should say, okay, there's anti-gravity craft now. And then based on that, once you accept that there's anti-gravity craft now, it seems like that should change the epistemology of looking back at the history of these alleged anti-gravity craft encounters that people have been saying they've been having since the 40s. So it kind of lowers the standard of evidence for those. Once you have one really solid case, then you can kind of feed that back into the other cases. And so my suggestion is that if you feed that back far enough, that you end up in the 40s, or at least the 50s, because there's a very prominent series of UFO sightings that happen around Washington D.C. in the early 50s, where we have professional aviators and some radar data and a bunch of people on the ground seeing the same kind of things. That it's like, well, okay, if Fravor and friends really saw an anti-grav craft, then probably those craft were saw at least in the early 50s, late 40s, in which case there's definitely not us, right? There's no humans involved that could do that at that point. So then we have aliens. So that's the argument that I find the most compelling. And, if I had to have one. But I think another reason why I'm more confident about this than most people are, less agnostic than most people are, is because I think at this point we now have multiple converging lines of argument, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've got that, the kind of anti-gravity craft style argument in the anti-gravity craft in the 40s, I think shows aliens. A person in the intelligence community with high-level clearances who's testifying under oath that we have aliens, that's a different kind of an argument. And I am intrigued by these weird things that have shown up in Peru, that I think the best explanation of them is that they are, in fact, the remains of some kind of living organisms that lived like 1,000 years ago, and they don't look like they're from our ecosystem. So that's a different argument. So that's at least like 3 distinct arguments. And so I started getting loud with 2, right? The kind of Grush and the anti-gravity craft kinds of things, and then the mummies showed up, and I was like, wow, this seems like another argument. So at this point, it feels like, just all things considered, the least complicated way to explain all of this is just that. And then, when you talk to people about these things, they will say things like, well, aliens should be the last resort explanation. Like, we should exhaust all other alternative explanations first. And there I also think that's not correct, because like we don't really have any idea what the probability of aliens is, right? So in philosophy we have this principle called the principle of indifference, which is basically, if you have no idea whether it's going to be one way or the other, the probability you should assign is 0.5, right? Like if you flip a coin, you have no idea if it's going to come up heads or tails, so you give it 0.5. So how likely is it that there are aliens out there? Well, gosh, we just have so little data that we should just assign it to 0.5. It's
That's
just as likely as there is that there isn't, right?
Yeah.
And then if you look at arguments like you get from Fermi, like to drive the Fermi paradox, there's all these stars out there that are millions of years older than ours, and from what we can tell, then they should have had planets around them millions of years before us, and so if there are technological beings out there, they could be millions of years ahead of us, and it doesn't take that long to traverse the galaxy, so we should have seen them already. So there's already this kind of prior argument that before you come to the evidence at all, you could just sort of think, well, how likely is it that there's aliens? Pretty likely. How likely is it that we would have encountered them and seen their probes? Pretty likely.
Yeah.
And then Fermi goes on and says, but we haven't seen them. But then I just want to say, no, actually, like we have. Like we.
When was that? When was Fermi?
Fermi's, oh gosh, I don't know. He's early 20th century physics guy. I don't know, quantum mechanics stuff.
Okay.
I think he's quantum mechanics. I don't know enough about Fermi.
Yeah, I mean, my question was mostly just like, I wonder what the state of things were whenever he popularized that paradox. Like,
yeah,
like I'm not sure what year that was.
I don't know either. But I do feel like it feels like 2023 was the year that it should have changed for all of us.
Yeah.
And I am, before we started here today, I talked about how I'm increasingly interested in the psychology of this situation, because it seems to me that 2023 should have convinced everybody that there are aliens.
That's interesting.
And it's not convincing everybody that there are aliens, and I'm puzzled about why.
It seems like the perspective from the more skeptical people would just be like, they just need more concrete evidence. So maybe it's just holding out to see what they come up with the Grush stuff. Or,
yeah. Well, so it's interesting because it seems to me that there's a paradigm shift going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so, kind of for people not paying close attention to what's going on, there's this sense of like, I don't really understand what's going on. I don't trust myself to be able to evaluate this well, so I'm going to kind of delegate the responsibility. Yeah, fair enough. Kind of delegate the responsibility for whether I'm going to believe this or not to the community of professional scientists, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
But, I've been hanging around philosophy of science and such long enough to realize scientists aren't really that much more rational than the rest of us, right? I mean, there's a very famous book in philosophy of science, the famous book in philosophy of science, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, which basically suggests that science does not progress linearly, but it goes through these revolutions, right? Like we kind of exist within a certain paradigm,
yeah,
and then the paradigm lasts beyond its usefulness for a while, as we start to see the fractures in the paradigm, and then a revolution will happen, and kind of all at once the whole scientific community will update based on the flaws in the prior understanding. So we've seen this happen several times. Kuhn makes this point. Like the most dramatic one in recent history is the rise of modern physics with Einstein's relativity and the quantum mechanics stuff. Just realizing that we were just catastrophically wrong in thinking about the nature of causality and time and all that kind of stuff, right? Which was a really big revolution. And so it seems to me that attentive observers can now, in a 2023 world, see the fractures in the paradigm just fine.
Yeah.
And I think if you're paying attention, you can be a little ahead of the paradigm shift and say, okay, the paradigm shift is coming, and the reason that that we haven't all made it yet is not really very interesting. It's just that the difficulties involved, the kind of psychological difficulties involved in reevaluating the number of things that we will have to reevaluate is so
field.
high. Yeah. I mean, essentially every field, right? Science, biology, history, religion, etc., right? It feels like the possible implications of the reality that not only are there aliens, but they are here, and especially if you go all the way to where I am, which is they've probably been here and somewhat actively involved in our history for at least thousands of years.
So wild.
Then you're really stuck with reevaluating so much that it's actually a kind of, I think you said earlier, like cognitive dissonance, right? Like a level of cognitive dissonance that approaches a kind of psychological trauma, right? So it's almost, in my view, I think the best explanation is that we are actually in denial, right?
Okay.
It's like those who are aware are in denial. Those who are aware and have not changed their minds are in denial. This is where I am, right? Like either you see the evidence and you're convinced, or you see the evidence and are not convinced for not good reasons. That's like the degree of confidence that I think is justified right now. But obviously not everybody shares that.
So you're in a place where you think Occam's razor is kind of shifted in the opposite direction.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
I think that's right. I think the kind of conspiracy, because essentially, in the first video I did about this, or the first kind of slideshow I did about this, I make this suggestion that so Grush and friends, because Grush is not alone. Grush is kind of speaking for a dozen to he said there's like a dozen people who are talking to Congress. There's like 40 or so people that he talked to behind the scenes, and he's not sure how many of them are talking to Congress, right? So we'll just call those people Grush and friends, right? So Grush and friends are alleging that there is this conspiracy to hide a UFO recovery program that's been going on since, in his view, or according to him, the 30s, actually, prior to the weird events that happened in the 40s. So either he and his friends are correct, and there is a conspiracy to cover up aliens, or they themselves are part of a conspiracy, or they are being duped by another conspiracy.
One second. I just wanted to make sure the gain was high enough. I was looking over.
That's fine.
Okay, I think we're fine. Sorry about that.
No,
Keep going.
So essentially, no one has the option to say there is no conspiracy. There is a conspiracy. At this point, it's just a question of which one it is. Right? Like, Grush is telling the truth, there is a conspiracy. Grush is not telling the truth, then he's either part of a conspiracy or the victim of a conspiracy. There's a conspiracy no matter how you look, right? So then you really do have to start asking the questions like, well, what's the Occam's razor version
between these two?
Between these ones. And that's just kind of focusing on the Grush thing. I think once you start looking at the anti-gravity craft thing, There just isn't a plausible explanation. Other than, I mean, I understand how ridiculous it sounds, right? But I don't think there's a plausible explanation other than aliens. And you know, I know that I'm somewhat in the well, I'm very much in the minority on the Nazca mummies, but I also think that the only plausible explanation is that they are in fact real remains of real organisms that are not from our ecosystem. So yeah, I think there's these at least kind of three converging arguments. Each one of them, the best Occam's razor answer is aliens, and collectively, in my view, clearly the best Occam's razor explanation is aliens.
Yeah, the interesting part about like parsing out the two options for conspiracies is like it seems like we're at a point, and Michio Kaku sounds like he's kind of at this point as well where like you mentioned the multiple sightings, multiple modes, I think how he puts it, and he's talking about how the burden of proof has shifted. The funny part about the like where the skeptics usually stand is like one of the quickest defense mechanisms is nobody can keep a secret. Now we're at a point though where like it seems like that defense is almost like pointing in the opposite direction. In a way. So in my view, the best response to that is the secret has never been kept. There is a consistent stream of whistleblowers since the 40s who have been saying something's going on. So the idea that there's been this successful attempt to keep it all secret, like, is just not informed about what's been going on. It's been leaking like crazy since day one. So I just don't find this argument at all compelling. And that argument, like, because one of the things that people will say about some of the craft is like, you know, like especially with Fravor and some of the ones from this century has been like, well, maybe there's some kind of a drone that, or like, we have some kind of advanced technology that, you know, top Navy pilots don't know about. You know, Fravor isn't convinced of that. Like, I've heard him talking about how, like, because that happened back in 2004, and he was talking about, like, a year or two ago, he's like, at this point, I think we would know. Like, if we had that back, you know, that long ago, I think we would know now. But then you go, well, that's the same kind of... It's the same situation that people have been talking about since 47.
Exactly.
Since the 50s. Like, there's no way.
That's right.
There's no way that we would have had this. The argument goes, there's no way we've had this kind of insane technology and kept it secret for 75 years. Like, there's...
No, because you have to imagine the profit motives involved in 100%. Putting products out that would utilize this technology to dominate, you know, military stuff, industrial stuff. Like, we could do space mining and get access to all these minerals that are rare on Earth and sell them for trillions and trillions of dollars. That's right. It's just not plausible. And I also don't think, even independent of that argument, it's not plausible that the military has developed anti-gravity craft. Like go talk to our best physicists, like our Nobel Prize winning physicists, and ask them, how do you build an anti-gravity craft? And they're going to say, we have no idea how to build an anti-gravity craft. So, like, the idea that the military could have hired such high-level physicists that they're making breakthrough physics discoveries.
Nobody else knows.
And no one else knows about it. And no papers are being published on it. And there's no, like, peer-reviewed discussion of this going on. Like, that's crazy. If we have anti-gravity...
And that long ago.
I'm saying even today. And then if you push it back into the 40s, it's absurd. It's like there's right?
Like with the rinky-dink planes we had flying around.
That's nuts. But I mean, even today, I don't think it's plausible. And you know, I do think there's enough weird stuff going on that it is actually possible at this point that the United States has anti-gravity craft. But if so, it's because we're reverse engineering it. So my claim is that the progress of physics, of professional, academic, published physicists is not sufficient to create an engineering project anywhere. So if there is an engineering project, it's a reverse engineering project.
Well, what do you think about Bob Lazar?
I know very little about Lazar. Like, I've watched whatever one of the documentaries about him. Lazar is a very odd character, right? The reason for me that I retain some skepticism about Lazar is it's honestly one specific detail, right? So Lazar says he was part of these like UFO reverse engineering kinds of exploration things, and specifically that he got access to some craft and was able to study it and be inside of it and try to understand how it works and all that kind of stuff. That I'm pretty open to, right? But then he makes this one specific claim, which is that first of all, that they are faster than light craft, and that the way they operate is that there is this this element 115, which if we create it with which when it exists in its stable form creates a kind of a space-time warping effect that allows for faster than light travel, right? So that's a pretty big claim, right? And it's just hard to know how to, and furthermore, he claims to have some. He claims to be in possession of.
Oh, he does?
Yes, some of this stable element 115.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And that he's like keeping it secret for some reason, right? So that's the claim that makes me go, I don't know what to think about Lazar, right?
Yeah.
Because he might be sitting on the definitive proof that there are faster than light equipped aliens on our planet, and he's not giving that to the parties who could demonstrate that it's true. Right, because that would be easily proven true.
Right.
Like if you had element 115, you could give it to any physics lab anywhere, and they could say, yes, this is stable element 115, and oh my gosh, look at how it's warping the time space.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a weird claim for him to be making, and so I don't. It's very strange. I don't know what to make of him.
Yeah, I didn't know that he said that he had some.
Allegedly, he has a piece of it.
What's his reasoning for not doing anything with it?
I have no idea.
Okay, fair enough.
No, but if you look at his behavior, it's very weird, right? He's very cagey about this, right? And apparently there's people ask him about details, and he waffles in various ways, and I don't know. I genuinely don't know. He's a weird character who's making a very weird claim, and allegedly has the power to back up the claim and isn't backing up the claim. So that collectively makes me go, this is a person who I can't just straightforwardly trust.
Yeah. Could you explain the Navy patent?
Yeah, so I can explain a little bit about the Navy patent.
Yeah, just like roughly what it is.
Yeah, so I'm not a physicist, right?
Yeah.
But there is a patent. I forget the name of it off the top of my head. I could look it up. But if you look up Navy patent, U.S. Navy patent. Inertial reduction device, you'll find
something
it.
Like that.
And it explains in a decent amount of detail how to use, I think it's some kind of electromagnetic field manipulation that impacts how the craft interacts with matter in such a way that it reduces the inertia. So obviously, standard Newtonian physics. Force equals mass times acceleration. So mass and inertia are related conceptually. Mass is essentially resistance to changes in inertia, right? So if you could turn that down, then you could accelerate it with much less force. So yeah, there's a patent out there. It tells you how to do it with a fair amount of details in the formula, and I'm not smart enough in the physics world to understand exactly how that even works out, but it's there. And I've done just a little bit of sleuthing to try to figure out, because of course you can get a patent without having any without having actually pulled off what you've patented, right? You can just be a concept.
Yeah.
But apparently there's like a Stack Overflow thread that I found where there was a patent lawyer who looked into it, who was like, no, actually it looks like there was some back and forth behind the scenes, asking for some kind of demonstration, and the Navy gave some kind of demonstration which was sufficient to get the patent to go through, right? So I don't know what to make of that, obviously, but It's very weird, and I think it's very, very weird that no one knows it's there.
Yeah, I know. I haven't heard anything about it.
Yeah, but it's just there. Like, Google
It's just
it,
there.
and it's right there. You can read. Apparently, you can read how to build an anti-gravity craft.
Yeah. So the question there would be, if somebody wanted to run with the theory that, like, see, we do know how to do these things.
Yeah.
The question would be, like, if we kept everything else secret, like, why can I just go and Google that?
Yeah. Fair enough. But this happened in, I think it was 2016 when that happened, right?
Okay.
And again, like, the physics that's described in there is not, like, published physics that we're seeing anywhere else. So I think if that's a real thing that we know how to do, I think the best explanation is Russia's explanation, that
Which
we
is
reverse
just that
engineered it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have, there's so much, which I didn't know until I was, like, doing prep for this. There's so much from 47 to today.
Yeah. Like, way more than I realized.
Me too.
Yeah.
It's
overwhelming.
Pretty quickly I was like, oh no. Like, this is a wild rabbit hole.
Yeah. So, like we were talking earlier, there's a nice documentary called The Phenomenon, which is probably the best beginning point if you want to kind of get an idea about how big this is.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
For you, is it kind of just a matter of, like, all things put together, or do you have like a few cases that you think really stand above? For me, like, I think the Tic Tac, Gimbal, Go Fast, like those videos, of course.
Yeah.
But, like, before that, like, do you have ones that, like, you think like, are really above the rest?
So I do. So and I'm just piggybacking on other work that smart journalists and people have done. There's a website, UFOs.wiki, which I think is the best resource for kind of a nice summary of where we are. There's a couple of books that have been put out and a couple documentaries, but all of them are kind of on there. So if you go to UFOs.wiki, they have a really nice database of cases, kind of the best of cases. That's where I found them, and I think that's the best resource to date to get started. So for me, there are kind of 4-5 cases that have kind of shaped how I think about this stuff. Nimitz is the most important one, the Tic Tac incident.
Yeah.
And then kind of going back in history, in the 80s, there was this wave in Belgium where, like, thousands of people alleged to see these hovering triangular-shaped craft. And the Belgian Air Force picked them up on radar and tried to engage, and it flew away. And then the Belgian Air Force just, like, gave a briefing on it and just talked about what happened.
I didn't even know about that one.
Yeah. So that one is really interesting. The Belgium wave is really interesting. And pushing back further in time, the DC wave in 52, 53, whenever that was.
Yeah, that one's weird.
That one's weird because it's also not an event; it's a sequence of events over multiple weekends.
Yeah.
And again, we have multiple witnesses, multiple sensors. That's a really interesting case. The kind of first really compelling case is, I'm so bad with remembering all the details, I should have looked this up, but there's a case in 47 where there's a pilot, Arnold, I think is his name. Kenneth Arnold, yeah. Now that's a solo case, and that
was kind of the first one that, like, spiked all this.
That's right. So it's interesting because it's the first one.
Yeah.
It's not really interesting as far as like, we don't have the multiple sensors, multiple witnesses.
Yeah.
But if you based on Nimitz and Belgium and DC say, okay, these things are out there, then it's very plausible that we should buy this guy's testimony. So you see what I mean? Like it's more like, if you're convinced by the other cases, you should take that one seriously.
Reasonable as well.
And then I think another case that I think is really interesting is the aerial school case in Zimbabwe.
I was going to ask about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I am completely convinced by that. Again, okay, so there's a kind of a two-tier way of thinking about this. One is like, you don't believe in aliens, or you don't believe in UFOs. Which ones should convince you? And I think the answer is Nimitz, Belgium, DC. Those are the ones to look at.
Yeah.
And then once you're convinced, then you should be like, oh, then I need to reevaluate all these other cases. What else can I know? Right? So like the Arnold case can say, well, I guess I can tell that they've been here since 47, right? So it's not like Arnold should convince you that there are anti-gravity craft, right?
Right.
Arnold should convince you, if you already believe that they're anti-gravity craft, that they've been here since 47, right? And so then jump to the conclusion from there, then they're probably aliens. Okay, well, if there's aliens, what should I take seriously? And then it's like...
That's interesting.
Right, does it make sense?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like the staged argument. So it's like, well, gosh, I guess if I believe that there are anti-gravity craft flown by aliens, then this case we see in Zimbabwe, where children claimed to have seen 3 of them, one of which lands, 2 aliens get out and communicate with them telepathically about the dangers of environmental degradation and abuse of technology, that, wow, maybe they're here and talking to us and concerned about these kinds of things and look like the standard image of an alien, because that's what the children say. And, because it's really interesting, these children, they don't seem to be lying, right? Like, there are standard tells for what a child looks like when they're lying. Their kind of reasons, motivations for lying don't seem to be there. They seem to be acting afraid, confused.
Yeah.
Unlike if it were a joke. Maybe if I do an interview again, I shouldn't do it in my office because of my singing frog.
It's okay.
Entertaining for the listeners.
It is great.
So I take that case pretty seriously, and what I take to the new piece of information that I think we can pick up from that is this idea not only that they are present, but that they look like that, and that they are communicating with us, at least sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe that they're telepaths, which is also very
so going like that progression that you described, if that leads you to Zimbabwe, and then you have like the claims of telepathic communication, they all had the same idea about it. It was like about the environment, and
That's
like
right.
we need to be careful with technology. That the same kind of communication thing was described in Virginia. What do you think about Virginia?
So I haven't looked into that case very much, just because I have limited temporal resources, and it seemed to me like there was nothing. I was already convinced of the things that allegedly demonstrates. So I believe that there's kind of an independent argument there, but I'm not as interested in it. I'm kind of more interested in other things. But that's so that case is interesting. I haven't looked into it much personally. For me, the next frontier of my interest is the abduction cases, right? Because, and in particular, the work of John Mack at Harvard, who fairly rigorously interviewed a bunch of people who alleged to have been abducted, and found a surprising amount of coherence among their stories, even when they shouldn't have been aware of each other's experiences, and that brings you to a whole other level of weirdness, because the abductees say, yes, there are these anti-grav craft, there are aliens that look like this, they are telepathic, and they are engaged in a hybridization project, right? That
they've been saying that?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar enough with those people.
So you can see there's this kind of progression, right? It's like anti-grav craft to aliens, aliens to telepaths, telepaths to abduction stories to hybridization, and then again, if you take these weird mummies in Peru seriously, which I do, they seem to be, at least some of them, this one called Maria, seems to be a human-alien hybrid. Which, okay, right? Like, at this point, we've taken on a lot, right?
Yeah.
And, and I think it's important to think through it in that sequential way.
Yeah.
And when you have these sequential arguments, you do need to realize that the probability of error increases at every one of those steps, right?
Yeah.
So even if you were 99% confident at each step, right, that 1% failure accumulates, right?
Yeah.
So that by the time you get to the end, you're making a much less plausible claim.
So just reduce your confidence as you go from step to step.
That's exactly right. So every step involved, you need to reduce your confidence.
Yeah. Yeah, the cool thing about with Virginia and Roswell is the Grush claims, him claiming that they have bodies, that is consistent with, it doesn't mean that they're true, of course, but that's consistent with the claims of Roswell, there were bodies, Virginia, there were bodies, the U.S. Air Force came in, picked them up.
That's right.
So you can work your way to being more it's like you use the term thinking critically and open-mindedly,
Yeah.
which I think is a good balance between the two.
Yeah.
Because critically typically like seems to for whatever reason like biased towards skepticism, which
Yeah.
is maybe not a healthy way to like look at these things necessarily.
Yeah.
But you can kind of like work your way up to entertaining things like Zimbabwe, things like Virginia.
That's right.
And then that, like you've hinted out a few times here, that takes us to Nazca.
Yeah.
Which, so just for some background on that, so September 12th, UFO journalist Jamie Masson, is that how you pronounce it?
I won't attempt pronunciation,
enough.
but that's how I say it.
We'll go with that.
Yeah. But I doubt that's correct.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So apologies for butchered Spanish.
Yeah,
words
exactly.
coming. But he comes forward with a group of scientists, like archaeologists, forensic biologists, radiologists, surgeons, and they roll out these alleged mummies that they've done testing on, and they claim that they're non-human. This, based on scans and testing that they've done, that case was almost unanimously like dismissed, mocked.
Yes.
Ryan Graves was at that hearing. He was very critical of it.
Yeah.
But you were willing to kind of like stick your neck out there and say, I think we're overlooking these, or maybe not like being open-minded enough about these. And it seemed like your argument was that the debunks weren't really based on much outside of like, this seems implausible. And then there's the ad hominem like attack against Masson.
Yeah.
Why were they so like unanimously just dismissed? Like, it seemed like the coverage wasn't very good for them.
No, the coverage was terrible.
Yeah.
And it is a very complicated case because so essentially these mummies are found, I want to say like 7 or so years ago, by Huaqueros, who are people who are the kind of pejorative versions, they're grave robbers, right? They kind of look around for archaeological sites and then they take the artifacts and try to sell them, right? So they gave some of these things or sold them, I don't understand exactly how it works, to an archaeologist in Peru. I think he's a French guy. And he started trying to get some attention from the Ministry of Culture in Peru and various other scientists and such, and was kind of not taken very seriously.
Yeah.
And so there was apparently like a crowdfunding campaign to try to get some money to do more research on these things. And, eventually some x-rays and some CT scans were taken and were made public. So what ended up happening was there were some people who were very suspicious of this and made an accusation that somebody in the history of these objects had intentionally created them as fraudulent out of human mummies. And maybe some animals from or some parts from other animals. And of course, if that's true, then those objects are created from the desecration of significant cultural objects and disrespect of human remains. And of course, if that were true, then it would be very seriously wrong. And so there is this kind of appropriate moral horror at what allegedly happened, which led to kind of a further stigmatization of taking them seriously.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, there have been a few people, in particular this guy Zalza Benitez, who's from Mexico, who has been taking them very seriously and trying to get more information about them. So at this point, like for instance, there's this live stream of them taking 2 of these mummies into a room in a hospital where they're scanned with multiple types of scanners during the live stream, so you can watch the scans being taken, you can see the results of the scans being analyzed by professionals. So it seems very unlikely that the scans themselves are fake. And I agree. Zalzi Benitez has this really nice argument, primarily based on the soft tissues that we find in these objects, that they couldn't have been artificially constructed as a hoax. That they're too biologically coherent, and so they must be the dried, desiccated remains of a coherent living organism. I buy his argument. He gave the argument at the Mexico hearing.
The first one?
The first one, yeah. And it was when I watched that, it was his argument that made me say, yeah, okay, he's probably right. Yeah. Now, I already believe in aliens because of Nimitz and things like that, so it's easier to convince me, right? But I actually think that the argument is totally independent of that, and so should be persuasive if you just pay attention to the scans and the argument based on the weirdness of the objects and the fact that they seem to be genuine remains of living organisms. If those are true, if they are genuine remains of living organisms, then those living organisms are so weird that they're not an ordinary part of our ecosystem.
Yeah, because they would have had to go back to beyond bony fish.
Yeah, at least because of
the way that their bones are, like only having one bone in the legs and the forearms, or something like that.
That's right. So there's a bunch of weird things about them. There are people who are doing DNA analysis on them.
So it's continuing.
Oh yeah.
Good.
Yeah. There's a lot of actually.
I was going to ask about that.
There is a fair amount of attention being given to them in certain circles, and again, the news coverage tends to be pretty bad. But if you're paying attention to kind of who's looking at them and what the data that they're seeing is, which honestly the easiest way to do this is, as frustrating as it is to do it on Reddit, right? r/UFOs, r/aliens, r/alien bodies.
Be careful.
Yeah, I know. So those ones in particular are the places to look. But you can at least kind of see how people who know how to analyze the DNA are analyzing them and looking into them. The thing that in my talk, I didn't talk about DNA very much because DNA analysis is not transparent to non-experts, especially ancient DNA. Like, you just have these tiny fragments of things that are mostly degraded, and then you have to extrapolate so much, and it's very, very difficult. Which is why the argument that I gave is based entirely on the anatomy, which because we can see the anatomy directly in the CT scan X-ray data that's been released. So my claim is, based on the fact that we know that these scans were taken by professional medical folk, that the interpretation of them that Zalzi Benitez gives is transparent. That we don't need experts to interpret them. Beyond what we've already been told by Zalzi Benitez. Like, look at these features of these things, aren't they weird? You can see those features and say, yes, they are.
Yeah. So one of the criticisms or supposed debunks after the first one was these are most likely fabricated.
Yeah.
Because there's been plenty. There's been the Fiji mermaids, and then there was the one in 2018, the one with like the weird head, or something. Has any case that ended up being fabricated made it through this stage where they're having people come forward with all these scans? Yeah, it seems like most of them got caught in the scanning stage. Like, none of them passed.
That's right. No, there's never been anything like this.
Nothing that's come this far.
No.
So like the conspiracy claim goes much further in this one, which is like you would have had to dupe all of these scientists, or they would have had to all be in on it, or they would have had to somehow miss it. It would have had to be constructed so well that all of these different tests couldn't catch it.
That's right.
And then for the second one, so there was a second hearing on the 7th. So a few weeks later, one of the criticisms after the first one, like you'll hear like Neil deGrasse Tyson and like all these people saying, we can't believe this until, just like with other scientific processes, you have multiple labs testing the samples, so like they have to release it instead of keeping it within a certain group. Didn't they do that to a certain extent in the second one? So they brought forward like 10 or 11 more scientists from a university in Peru that said that they'd been studying it for like 3 to 4 years and claimed that they're genuine and not fabricated.
That's right.
So that's a different group of scientists.
That is a different group of scientists.
So we have two groups now saying that like these are not fabricated. Like, we've tested them, we've scanned them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I would say there's at least on the order of 15 to 20 distinct scientists who have seen them directly or seen the scan data and said these are not fakes.
Yeah. Yeah. Leading into this, I was like, I was waiting for that second one. Like we had talked about doing it after.
Yeah.
Because the second one was coming, and it's been a couple of weeks now since, and I was like waiting for the press, partially because like I have a hard time knowing what I'm looking at.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I wonder what they're gonna say.
Yeah.
There's been almost nothing about it.
Almost nothing.
What like.
Yeah, I know, it's weird.
It just after I was excited because I was like, okay, the second one's gonna come. They brought new people forward.
Yeah.
Which that steps in the direction of what people claim that they wanted.
Yep.
And now there's like
and now they're not talking
it just
about
went completely silent.
Yeah. I know. It's very,
so
very
annoying.
weird. So this is where I think the best explanation has to be something like we're in denial, right? Like it's almost like the more convincing the evidence becomes, the less willing we are to actually look at the evidence.
Yeah.
Right?
I can't believe it just fell off. Because there was so much coverage after the first one.
I know.
And everybody was critical, but then the second one happened and nobody batted an eye.
But this is my suspicion, right? Like, we had the coverage because everybody felt like they could dismiss it. And once it becomes like we feel like we can't dismiss it, we almost can't look at it, right? Because it's just so hard to swallow. So it's like the more people become convinced that it can't be easily dismissed, the quieter they get.
Yeah, which is what gets us into like where you're thinking more, it seems like, which is the initial criticisms were, it's like, fair enough, you want to see more hard evidence.
Yeah.
Now it's starting to seem like we're flirting with at least certain groups who just do not want to let go of the premises that they're holding on to that would be completely disrupted by something like this.
Yeah, so if you think about it, it's like, dismiss. Oh no, I need to take this seriously. And then there's like this hesitance to talk at that point, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like, oh, I might be wrong. I'm going to be quiet while I evaluate this further, right? That feels like the stage that we're in. Like, we feel comfortable being loud when we're sure that it's wrong.
You can mock it and like...
Right.
Yeah.
And then once it starts to become clearer that maybe it isn't wrong, we start getting thoughtful.
Yeah.
And that feels like the phase that we're in now, where it's like people who are paying attention, who aren't me, are mostly saying like, oh, wow, this is weird, let's take this seriously, but I don't know what to say about it.
Yeah.
And I'm perfectly comfortable saying, what? No, it's aliens. Like, it's obviously aliens. There isn't another plausible explanation. And so let's jump to the conclusion. Let's go through the paradigm shift. The revolution has happened, and I don't see any reason not to make the switch.
So with the DNA, my understanding is that so far with these hearings, the claim from many of the scientists has been, we don't necessarily know if they're extraterrestrial, but they're definitely non-human.
Right.
There is. Am I wrong about this? But I'm not sure if I had this correctly. Were there signs of human, or not human, just like creatures on Earth, of their DNA in these things?
Okay, so yeah, good. So the DNA analysis is really complicated. But before we get to DNA, let's just quickly say, in the conversation between you and me right now, we've kind of been conflating the concept alien with the concept extraterrestrial, and I actually do try to keep those two distinct, right? Okay. Because like people like Grush don't like to say extraterrestrial; they like to say non-human intelligence, right?
Yeah.
And I agree with Grush's caution there, right? Like, to say that we have a species that is not human and seems to be intelligent doesn't directly imply from another planet, right?
Yeah.
Which is what extraterrestrial means. So they could be weird things from our own planet, from, something on a kind of an unknown branch of evolution that for some reason we don't see for the most part in the fossil record or in our living experience. That's possible. It's possible that there's some kind of higher dimensional beings or alternate dimensional beings that we're dealing with. It's possible that there's all kinds of possibilities. People like to throw out time travelers. I think time travel doesn't make any sense, so I don't think it's time travelers. And in fact, I'm very skeptical of anybody that says they think it's time travelers for that exact reason.
Why does it have to be time travel?
I have no idea.
What does time travel have to do with it?
I don't know.
Why can't it just be beings from another?
Yeah, I don't know. There's weird stuff going on. So like, as much as I think I agree with you that the coverage of the second Mexico hearing was very disappointing, there were a couple of really weird things that happened at the second Mexico hearing. And again, I am concerned about Maussan and his kind of sensationalist journalist angle.
Yeah.
So like, he brought a rapper out there to talk at the second
Really?
Mexico hearing, and there was a guy who had some weird theory, like alternative theory of evolution, who thinks that they're from the future coming back to us, and it's very, very strange. Weird things get said in this space that I think we need to be very careful about. Again, right, like you said, my phrase is critically open-minded. I think we do need to use our critical thinking skills as we're trying to ponder what these things are. So anyways, I think non-human intelligence, all I mean by alien is non-human intelligence, and I think we should remain somewhat agnostic about what exactly they are and what kind of origin explanation we have for them. Bracketing that. If you take the mummy seriously, which I do, then there's more than one type. There are at least 3 types of mummies. So there are these things that are called humanoid reptiles. Josephina is the most described, scanned of them. Mauricio and Clara are the ones that were shown in Mexico. Clara is the one that we have the live stream scans of. They're very strange. They have these continuous circular ribs without sternum. They have the strange arm and leg structures, which seem very different from us. They have eggs in their the females have eggs in their abdomens, and apparently whole reproductive systems. You can see the whole oviduct and the structure of the eggs as they develop. So it's very, very odd, and that seems to be a species. There's this, at least one mummy, although there appear to be multiples of them of a different kind. The one that's called Maria is the most scanned of these. She, or they, I guess we don't really have good information about whether it's male or female, have a different sized skull. So it's a human-like skull, but the cranial capacity is higher than the ordinary human skull. So, we have evidence across the world, including in this part of Peru, of people who intentionally deform infants' heads by binding them before the skull solidifies. But that doesn't change the volume of the skull. And apparently the volume of the skull is too high. Okay. And it lacks, external ears. It has no hair, and the weirdest thing about it, physically, anatomically, is that it has 3-fingered hands and 3-toed feet, with different numbers of phalanges. So it's a very, very strange specimen. And apparently, the DNA from that has been analyzed, and is allegedly, this was said by somebody at the second Mexico hearing, that the DNA of that object is a hybrid of humans, and I think it's chimpanzees and bonobo and something else.
So unidentified something else.
Unidentified something else. So even if it's human chimpanzee bonobo, this was found in Peru, and chimpanzees and bonobo are in Africa. Right, so that's hella weird, right? And so I don't know enough. I don't know anything about how to parse DNA data, so I have no idea about how to take that claim. But if that claim is correct, then we have direct evidence of somebody performing intentional cross-species hybridization, including humans. Again, if you take the kind of chain of argument that we went down before, where you're taking abduction stories seriously, this is an existing
theme. That adds a new piece to it, because I didn't know those claims. Yeah.
So there are people who allege to have been abducted by aliens and have had reproductive material taken from their bodies or implanted in their bodies, or they have seen human, non-human children hybrids. Those are in the stories that are told by abductees, right? could that all be hallucination or dreams or some kind of strange psychological projections? Yes, but if we have a mummy with hybrid DNA that we've studied, then again, you can see how kind of all these pieces start to feed back into each other into a kind of coherent story, which is not only strange, but somewhat terrifying and very, very weird, which the whole narrative I'm trying to take pretty seriously. Yeah. Recognizing that in order to get the whole narrative, you do have to stack all these arguments. Yeah. So your confidence in the larger the narrative gets, the more pieces you have to stack to get to it, the less confident you should be, right? But then, what ends up happening is, this is just how science works in general, right? Where you kind of make these extrapolative arguments that get less and less plausible, but then you have a testable point, right? And then you're like, well, let's go check that testable point. And then if you do the testable point and the test comes back positive, then you can kind of reinforce the whole thing. Yeah. So that's the idea, right? Where it's like, well, gosh, we have this kind of speculative chain of arguments about human-alien hybrids. Well, then maybe there is one. Okay, we just found one. Let's check its DNA. Yes, it is. Well, okay, at that point, then the whole thing gets bolstered by that piece of evidence, right? So, and again, like in the lore of the bodies that Grush says exists, or Grush and friends say exist, like there is apparently evidence that in the lore that these things are hybridized with humans somehow, and so Grush and friends might be sitting on a direct proof that we have. Here's the DNA like we can show you the body, we can show you the sequence. That information might exist and might be classified and might be being hidden from the public. That's what's claimed. And so, but that's why I think these mummies are so fascinating, because they're not classified. They're just in Mexico and Peru being studied by scientists who are admittedly not the cream of the crop, top tier research institution scientists. They're not. But that seems to be because of the stigma, right? Like, the claim of everybody involved with the Nazca mummies is that they have been asking people to study them, and that no one will come study them. Yeah. And the second
because of the reactions that they've had.
Because of the reactions that
immediately just
that's right
getting mocked.
So this seems to be a situation where there are people with some really interesting data that are trying to be transparent about the data, and nobody's paying attention to them because of the stigma.
So where are they going now? Because again, the criticism is let the samples out, let everybody test them.
Yeah. So the what they push back and say is come here. Okay. We don't want to send them, from what I understand. We don't want to send them to the United States. The people should come to us. I don't really understand this, whether that's true or not. We know that there are some in Peru that people can go and look at and study. We know that there are some in Mexico that people can go and look at and study. And so I do worry about this criticism that's well, why don't they send them to Europe? Why don't they send them to the United States?
It seems like there's some logistical problems there.
And it feels just more plausible to say, well, why don't you go there, right?
It's we don't do that.
Yeah. Well, and you can get into, and I think it's worth getting into to some extent, some of these strange cultural expectations that we have, right? Yeah. That's well, we're only going to trust it if it comes from an American or a European institution.
There's definitely that.
And it's well, okay, I hear that. The kind of the highest level professional publishing scientists are in universities outside of South America. But gosh, those are still serious scientists, serious medical professionals who are saying, no, look, we looked at them and we can tell the difference between a fake joint and a real joint because we perform surgery on joints, right? I feel like we should take those people seriously. And I do worry about, the kind of artifact problems that we've seen, right? The British Museum has all of these artifacts from all over the world that one could argue were stolen from these places and haven't been returned. And so, you could imagine very plausible reasons for Peruvians to say, these are our artifacts, they belong in Peru, if you'd like to study them, come to Peru, and I'm on their side. Like,
fair enough.
Serious scientists from Europe and the United States, from more kind of academically respectable institutions, get your butts down to Peru. That's not that hard to do. Like, there's real scientific equipment down there. Go and be an ally to these teams and provide some additional credibility to what they're doing. Why isn't that happening? Stigma.
Right.
Racism. Right? Like, it's a mess. So I agree with the decision to leave the objects in Peru and Mexico and say, you know what? Our doors are open. If you're a serious person, I mean, this is, like Mosan said this in the second hearing. Any serious seeker with scientific credentials who wants to come from any institution to take this seriously, we will give you access to that.
Oh, cool.
Like that was, so great. So where are the people doing that? Like, hey, Neil deGrasse Tyson, I know you're not a biologist, you're a physicist, so grab your biologist friends and go to Peru. Why aren't you doing that? Or pick whoever else there is who knows what they're doing and go to Peru. And I think we do have to be somewhat suspicious about the skeptics who aren't going to get the data themselves.
Yeah, and that's the part that kind of sucks about the original response.
Yeah.
It's like, we didn't, like, our press and all the people speaking out didn't exactly make it easy for our scientists to be willing to go down there.
Yeah.
Because it's like, with the way that we treat it, nobody's going to want to be like, no Harvard scientist is going to want to be like, all right, I'm going to go down and study them.
Right.
Everyone's going to be like, because there does seem to be this weird, like, people walking on eggshells in the scientific community.
Yes. Which makes sense, honestly, because it is true that as soon as you get branded as a wacko, you're going to have a hard time getting grant funds for the things you want to do, and right, like, So, like, I hear it. This, like, the powers of stigmas are very real, but it obviously this is very different from the Me Too movement for all kinds of ways, right? But there are some parallels here where it's like all of these women said for decades, we're being mistreated and exploited in these ways, and it kind of took this cultural moment where it comes to a certain amount of prominence, where everybody starts paying attention to all the cases at once, and then the kind of cultural expectation shifts, and all of a sudden people's testimony is being taken more seriously. That hasn't happened here yet.
Do you think we're on the verge of that?
I do think we're on the verge of that. Yeah.
Well, why did they bring it to the Mexican Congress?
It's very strange. I don't know. So Zelza Benitez is the person who works within the Mexican Navy, who he's got a degree in forensics medicine, and he was like head of the legal and forensics department in the Mexican Navy, and he's higher ranked than that now, or higher placed than that now. So he's one of the people who's been heavily involved since the beginning. So it makes sense for him to kind of do this in Mexico, where there are some apparently more resources than there are in Peru to do some of the scans and stuff, or at least to kind of independently confirm from there. It's an open question about how exactly they got to Mexico, because Peru was apparently suing Maussan, the journalist, for bringing them to Peru, and Maussan was like, I didn't bring them to Peru. To Mexico. I didn't bring them to Mexico. So how did they get to Mexico? Either they were found in Mexico, which is a possibility, or they were found in Peru and sold to people in Mexico illegally. Because we already know that this is happening with the Holqueros. Like, they find stuff and then they'll sell them across borders when they really legally shouldn't do that. So we don't actually know kind of how they got to Mexico. My suspicion is that they were sold to some wealthy person in Mexico, kind of under the table, and then Zelza Benitez and friends found out about it and kind of brought them to public knowledge. That's my guess, but I'm obviously just speculating.
So you have that kind of baggage. You have criticisms of Maussan.
Yeah.
You have which led to the criticisms after the first hearing, and all of that's kind of just keeping some of our scientists scared.
Yeah.
So it's like holding people back from being willing to investigate them.
Yeah.
Another part that is interesting about this is these were found in Nazca.
Yeah.
Okay, so where we left off was these mummies coming from Nazca supposedly, which is where the Nazca lines are. Could you go into those? I find those fascinating.
Yeah. So another thing that's interesting about the mummies is the kind of general historical, cultural context of Peru, right? Because there are already some very weird things going on in Peru. So there are these petroglyph lines in the ground. So I forget exactly how. Are you good on time?
Yeah, we're good.
Yeah. So I forget exactly how they were made, but they're pre-Columbian, 500 to 700 years old, I think is what they say, and they are these large shapes on the ground. There's a lot of them, a dozen or more of them that represent, that they're images of like snakes and spiders and
stuff.
birds and stuff like that.
Yeah.
There's a couple things that are weird about them. One is that you can't see them from the ground level. You have to see them from the sky.
Yeah.
They're
so big.
Because they're very, very large, right? The only way to see the whole thing at once would be to be up higher than anybody should have been able to get at that point in history. So that's very weird. Why would you make these things to try to, they could only be visible from the sky when you can't fly. And then, one of them in particular looks like an alien. It looks like
typical gray.
Yeah, the typical kind of gray alien with a kind of big eyes and a bulbous head. And so, people have been conspiratorial, ancient aliens-y about this area long before the mummies were found. And there are other weird things, too. So there was a group of people called the Paracas people who predate the Nazca lines, we have a bunch of their skulls that have been elongated. And this does seem to be explainable biologically by the binding of human skulls, right? Like squishing an infant's skull before it fully forms until it forms in that shape. But there's still a strange cultural question about why you would do that, because of course that wouldn't be very comfortable to the child, and it would be a decent amount of work. And apparently there's some kind of cultural reason for thinking that they did it to look like their gods. So that's very strange. If we actually have mummies of non-human beings who have that kind of shape of a skull, that would be very strange.
Yeah.
The more you dig, the weirder it gets. I mean, we have, this is one of the Nazca area in Peru is one of these places where we have a certain quality of stonework that seems like it's out of sequence. Like the precision of stone cutting and the fit of the stones seems like it's not normal for the level of technological development that we see in the surrounding area. Now, of course, it's possible that those people just happen to be especially skilled stoneworkers. That's, of course, quite possible. But again, if we already think that there's some kind of strange contact with another species going on, then that looks like another thing that might get explained in an unusual way. Like I said, the more you scratch, the weirder it gets. There are these objects called the Ica stones, ICA, which are very weird. Like they have engravings on them of what look like UFOs, of apparently there's one that indicates like people performing brain surgery. There are some of people, like humans, riding on dinosaurs. Now, look, like these have long been considered to be a probable hoax, but it's hard to say, right? Like, so you can radiocarbon date a mummy. Or the materials surrounding the mummies, but you can't really radiocarbon date a an engraving on a stone, right?
Yeah.
Because the stone is way older than that,
Right. So,
and
like,
it's
when
hard
it
to
came-
say when it was engraved, right?
Yeah.
But there are a lot of these things, these ecostones, and they might have been a hoax, but again, maybe not. Like once you make a pivot, let's say you buy that even one of the mummies is legitimate, then you should come to the conclusion that there was human-alien contact in Peru thousands of years ago.
So crazy.
And then at that point, like once you've made that jump, then again, like we said before, right? Like once you make a jump based on that, then you should go back and reevaluate a bunch of things. Like, well, I guess maybe the Nazca lines really were visible from the sky because there were flying saucers around, and well, maybe that explains why we have these carvings of flying saucers, and maybe that explains why we have these deformed skulls, and maybe that explains. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's in general, I think this explanatory structure is how we should be thinking about these, right? Like skepticism about the alien hypothesis makes sense until you get this like pivotal piece of data that really can't be explained by anything else. Like the Nimitz case, Grush's testimony is very strange. I contend that these mummies are real. Like if any one of those is correct, then the paradigm has to shift.
Yeah.
And then once the paradigm shifts, then you have to reevaluate a bunch of stuff.
Yeah. So they're not sure about the carvings on the stones, but the Nazca lines they're pretty confident are hundreds of years old.
Yes. Yeah.
Do they have any kind of explanation for that?
No, I mean the standard explanation about these things, which is that it was probably some kind of religious thing trying to communicate to the gods in some way.
Yeah.
But again, like once the paradigm shifts, then you do have to kind of go back and revisit these things. Like, basically every group of people across all of human history has said that they have had contact with some kinds of strange beings who came from the sky, non-human beings who came from the sky, and we can dismiss all of that as kind of superstitious mythological attempts to explain the world before there was science. But once you've made the paradigm shift, then it makes more sense to say, oh, they were probably just talking to aliens.
Yeah, so in the second talk you mentioned that at the end.
Yeah.
You talk about various mythologies, the sculptures, I think, in Japan.
Yes.
Like, there's all kinds of different things
Yeah.
of cross-culturally across time of depicting these same kinds of beings.
Yeah.
You mentioned something about a mythology about beings coming down and teaching people agriculture. Where was that?
So it's kind of everywhere, right?
Okay.
Like, I mean, and clearly, there is a mythologization of things, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm not denying that, but yeah, like I don't even claim. Basically, every culture says that some
Pretty much.
that some beings, some divine beings, taught us, medicine, metallurgy, agriculture. Just look at basically all of the myths of the world, right? That we were taught these things by deities, and the deities are specifically associated with coming from the sky, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, there's specific examples in we actually do have at least one substantial surviving text from South America. I think it's called the Popol Vuh, which was not destroyed by the Spanish and Portuguese.
Yeah, that sucks.
So I mean, there were written records, right? There was a written language, or at least multiple written languages in the Americas that were basically wiped out intentionally by the colonial powers. But there was the Popol Vuh. I don't know. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but was written down by one of the missionaries and preserved. And there's stories in there about humans interacting with divine beings and learning these kinds of things. But they're just kind of all over the place. You can kind of pick any society and see that.
Yeah, it would be so cool if we knew more about what those people thought.
Yes.
Before we just came in and kind of obliterated
Yes.
those traditions.
Yes.
And it's kind of funny that conversation is happening in a time when we're like, for the last couple hundred years we've been going through a period of devaluing religious traditions
Yes.
and replacing them with our current scientific knowledge.
That's right.
And in some sense, like, these kinds of things are pushing back against that in a way when it looked like it was pretty universally like, we're getting rid of those things, we're getting rid of these superstitions, like they had them for these reasons but they're no longer rational. Now you have cases like this and it's like, well, we can't really do that anymore. Like, we should probably be more careful about getting rid of all of these things that all of these people have said everywhere.
Yeah, and unfortunately that trend of dismissing those stories predates the kind of modern scientific movement, right? With religions that get imperialistic, right?
Yeah.
There are kind of imperialistic and non-imperialistic versions of basically every religion, so we don't need to pick on any one particular party here, right? But there is an imperialistic religious trend, which is, we've got it figured out and we can wipe out everybody that disagrees with us. That, as I say, has emerged in many places at many points in history with many different belief systems, so I don't think we can point the finger at any one group. But yeah, there's a very real worry at this point that we have lost our best data on what might have happened by ignoring the stories of our indigenous people. Which, there's all kinds of reasons to be worried about the amount of beautiful cultural insights that we lost by these kind of colonial imperialist attitudes, which is, we should not over-romanticize anything, right? Any group of people has beautiful things and ugly things. So of course that's true. Like, it's not like there was an ideal group of people anywhere that then got demolished, right? But I think it is undeniable that lots of beautiful, valuable things were destroyed. This is another reason to add to what should be our existing frustration with the way that indigenous people have been treated all across history.
Have the lost civilization people touched the Nazca lines, like the Graham Hancocks, like Machu Picchu's in Peru?
Yep.
Have they talked about the Nazca lines at all?
I'm sure they have.
Yeah.
So it was interesting. You talked earlier about the kind of overwhelming amount of UFO cases that there are. Like, you very quickly realize that it's an insurmountable task to catch up on it all.
Yeah.
And especially once you start expanding out from, UFO sightings to things like, how do we reinterpret all of ancient history and mythology? It's just too much to know, right? So I don't have any idea how plausible any of these claims are. But I suspect that they're much more plausible than we thought they were. It's
starting to seem like the tides are turning in terms of like entertaining that. Like, Hancock got the Netflix documentary originally. I think his first books or something came out in the 90s or something like that, but it was a long time ago, and like they're just now coming around to accepting that. So we're in phases like that. The other weird part about the mythologies is that, they're all universally claiming that these beings are supporting us and trying to like help us flourish.
Yeah.
And that connects to the, this goes, obviously there's speculations from the community, but from the UFO community and UFO lore, but the substantial amount of sightings at the nuclear bases.
Yes.
Which led to the theory of we dropped the atomic bomb, 2 years later, all these sightings start.
Yes.
And the speculation then becomes, they see what they're trying to like put a halt to, us potentially sparking something that could destroy the planet.
Yeah.
So like that's congruent, those ideas, across hundreds of years.
Well, and not only the timing, but the location. Like, Roswell, New Mexico is where the 509th Bomb Group was that dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's right next to where the nuclear test site, the Trinity test, happened. And so, yeah, that's right. it is undeniable that in the lore there's a strong association between UFO presence and nuclear sites. And yeah, I forget exactly where it was, but there's a very famous case, I think it was in Montana, where there was a nuclear silo location where there was something that hovered over there, and that all the 10 nuclear missiles were simultaneously disabled. And this has been, the records of that have been officially declassified. You can read the records of them.
Yeah.
So again, you can be speculative about whether that's the best explanation, but the people on site said that's what happened.
Yeah. That happened multiple times.
Yeah, it has happened multiple times. And there was a very weird case, I think it was in Russia, where they actually turned on the launch sequence.
Yeah.
And then turned it off.
It off.
Yeah. So this is very weird, and this is discussed in, I think this is discussed in
it's in the Phenomenon.
In the Phenomenon documentary, so that's a good place to get started on those things. But yeah, that seems right, and to engage in some not entirely baseless speculation, but what is definitely speculation.
Yeah.
There does seem to have been, in 2023 in particular, this kind of change in how much information is available to the public, and you could start asking questions about why, and there's an obvious answer staring us all in the face, which is how warm it is here in November. This is a record-breaking, every month since, I forget, July or something, has been the hottest one on record for 125,000 years. So, there's good reasons to believe that if there is kind of a shift in policy among whoever is trying to kind of keep these things under wraps to being a little louder about them, it's very likely something to do with the fact that we are on the brink of a pretty substantial ecological crisis, environmental crisis. So, you could tell a story. Here's a story. Once upon a time, for whatever reason, these non-human intelligences were more involved in human history. See the Nazca mummies, see the Nazca lines, things like that. See the almost universal testimony of humans saying that they encountered beings from the sky who taught them stuff. So let's say there was some era where these non-human intelligences were more involved in our history. Then for some reason they seem to have backed off and mostly left us alone to do our own thing and run our own show until we started dropping nukes. And then some weird stuff started to happen, which was mostly kept under wraps for some reason. And now it looks like the wraps are coming off.
Yeah.
And we're being made more aware of what's going on, why this seems to suspiciously correlate with the worst climate crisis that the world has seen for a long time.
Yeah. So we have a lot. There's a lot to think about.
Look, if this paradigm shift is real,
then
it's the biggest paradigm shift we've ever had.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. So where does that leave you now? How thinking about these things, it seems like you think that we're in a period where it's going to take people some time to let go of things that we've let go of ideas that we've clung to for our stability and our understanding of the world. And you're saying that you think that you're just a little bit ahead of the curve along with others, and accepting things that down the line will come and radically change the way that we think about our place here.
Yeah.
On a daily basis, how has this influenced the way that you've been thinking about things?
Yeah, so for me, I went through a kind of frenetic, paranoid, obsessive season, right? Mm-hmm. Where it was like, oh shit, I am really behind on something really important. This started for me when David Grush first published his article in the Debrief in June, I guess it was, right? And so I rapidly, over the course of several months, tried to get as caught up as I could on everything I could find about aliens and UFOs, and so there was this kind of ravenous research period that I went through, which ultimately culminated in me giving these talks about how to think about these things. And then there was kind of another version of that happened when the Nazca mummies came out. At this point, I feel much more settled, right? It feels much more like, okay, I'm kind of up to speed as much as any of us can be that stand on the outside of whatever secret information there is. Obviously, I would like to have access to that information, but I don't. And so, I'm not personally interested in the kind of political activities that might be, involved in trying to force that material to come out. People seem to be doing this. The Grush testimony seems to have triggered some secret series of events behind the scenes to try to make the political powers that be let some stuff out. I don't feel like getting particularly involved in that.
Yeah.
For me, it feels to some extent like a return to pseudo-normality. My job as a philosophy professor, I, teach my classes, and I am interested in the same kinds of things I was before, and I do kind of look at everything through an alien-tinted lens now, which is interesting to kind of ask those questions about what this changes and how and why, and but it feels a little more stable than it did since I feel more stable today than I have since, June, when the crisis for me began. And it does feel like stuff's moving, things are happening, people are starting to understand, the stigmas are changing, the paradigm shift is happening. And, my natural tendency, I think all of our natural tendencies, is to want things to happen very quickly. But I think one of the upshots of all of this is, assuming I'm correct, that whoever the powers that be are in the alien world, they seem to be very patient, right? They seem to be content to wait for thousands of years for things to happen, and so I don't think we should expect that that things are going to get super loud, super fast.
Yeah,
right?
I can't imagine.
No. Unless there is some pressure to do so quickly, like for instance, if we really are on the verge of like a major climate collapse, then there might be some reason to accelerate it to a rate that is uncomfortable for us. Nonetheless, it does seem like it's whatever this kind of disclosure trajectory is, does look like it's trying to be as untraumatizing and uninvasive as possible.
Yeah.
But I do really worry. I mean, the climate stuff metrics that we hit this year have shocked the climate scientists who've already been pretty pessimistic. We seem to be, from what I understand, like half a degree hotter than the models were predicting we were, which is bad. I know everybody, like, it's hard to care about half a degree, right? But half a degree at the scale of the whole climate is very, very concerning.
Yeah.
And especially over the time period that we've seen. So we really could be on the verge of something pretty catastrophic, in which case maybe the pace really is picking up. So, 2024 is going to be an interesting year, right? My suspicion is that by the time we hit the end of 2024, a lot more people will be having the conversation that you and I are having.
Yeah.
But I bet we don't get, I don't know. I would love for whoever the president of the United States is by the end of next year to, get up on the podium and say, hey, here's what's going on.
Can you imagine?
Yeah, I can imagine. We've all imagined, right? So, you can imagine a very clear scenario, which is, alien motherships hover over every major city, and the president gets on the line and says, hey, they're all here, and here's what they're up to, right? And to some extent, it's a natural question to ask why that hasn't happened, and I think the answer has to be something like, it would be really bad for us. We would really freak out, and we probably wouldn't. It would probably destabilize us to such a degree that it would not be wise to do that. So whoever is kind of orchestrating the flow of information. Our awareness of what's going on seems to be sensitive to that and is trying to do it more gently, more slowly. But it does seem like for those with the inclination to look at what's out there, that actually the evidence is pretty compelling.
Yeah. Yeah, the societal collapse, mass freak out is one of the explanations being given to why it might be reasonable for them to kind of hide this kind of information from the public.
Yeah.
Because if you have 330 million people, like, with their entire worldview shook up.
Well, it wouldn't be that.
Well,
like, it would be everybody. It would be the whole planet.
Yeah.
All 7 billion of us would freak out.
Yeah. So you're in this period of...
But it's hard to imagine any political structure
100,
remaining stable through that transition, right?
Well, I mean, because things have toppled over with much
less.
Much less of a stressor than this.
That's right. And our frogs are.
And our frogs.
Yeah.
So you're in this period of, like, you went through the research phase and now you're kind of just waiting for the new things to come out.
Yeah.
For other people that want to get, like, I haven't been, like, nearly as far down in the research. Like, I've done, like, some a little bit.
Yeah.
For people that want to kind of get up to speed, you mentioned UFO Wiki.
Yeah.
We've talked about the phenomenon, which I think is really good. Is that kind of where you would direct people?
Yeah, so I would say there's a few resources I would recommend. UFOs.wiki is really, really good, and it contains some links to documentaries and books and things like that you could read to get caught up on. I would also call attention to, once you've come to believe in aliens, I would recommend looking at John Mack's books to kind of wrap your mind around the alleged abduction phenomena.
The Harvard psychologist.
The Harvard psychologist guy. Because that looks like the closest information that we have to seeing what they might actually be doing, right? And beyond that, like, there's so much, right? Like, there's just, like, podcasts and documentaries, and, yeah, so it's pretty damn overwhelming, and so I think it's hard to say where you should go after that. So watch The Phenomenon, look at UFOs.wiki, look at John Mack's books, and then welcome to the madness, because at that point there's so much, and one thing you'll discover once you start taking this stuff seriously is that there are well-established factions internal to the UFO alien community, right? Like, people who are absolutely convinced that it's time travelers, or absolutely convinced that they're extra-dimensional, or absolutely convinced that they're demons, or, right, like, there are factions already in place which is not surprising given how important this would be and how little information we have. Yeah. There's so much wild speculation out there. So, I mean, John Mack I like because he has done a good job gathering information in a way that tries to not jump to conclusions, tries to not draw conclusions, just say here's the data, here's what people say happened to them, and notice these interesting trends. What's the explanation? I'm not going to give you the explanation, right?
Yeah, I need to check that one out.
Yeah. But that general style is where I am, like, try to get informed about what people are saying, try to be open-minded about what might be out there, and probably don't come to any conclusions, because clearly we're not in a good epistemic situation right now. There's a lot of information that we know exists, but isn't public, and we don't know exactly what it is, right? Like, we know that the U.S. government is hiding certain pieces of information from us. Like, members of Congress have said, we have seen photos and videos that have not been released to the public, and we don't know why. Like, so we know for a fact that there's stuff being hidden from us. So that means that we know that we're in an unusual situation where we don't have access to all the relevant information. And that's a very frustrating place to be, but don't jump to many conclusions right now, because I think the conclusions we can jump to are there are anti-gravity craft, they are aliens, some of them are aliens, some of the aliens look like our stereotypical image of them, and they've probably been here for thousands of years, and they probably are hybridizing us for some reason. that's a lot to swallow.
Yeah.
That's where I am. And then
Yeah.
past that, well, a million questions and not a lot of answers.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot for being willing to. Thanks a lot for being willing to do this.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this one. And yeah, thanks for being willing to like stick your neck out there with some of this stuff, because it seems like it's easy, especially in academia, to like be afraid of criticism and like not be willing to think things through, compared to just taking the easy answer, the easy pill to swallow.
Well, and it's interesting, right? Because as a philosophy professor, I don't have any scientific credentials on the line, right? Like, I'm not claiming any of that kind of expertise. I'm trying to like look at the structure of the evidence and what rests on what, and so it feels like we had talked a little bit. I don't want to go too far down this road because I know we've been long for a while, but there are interesting parallels between the kind of philosophy, argumentative structure, epistemology of this, and things in the philosophy of religion, which is something that I am pretty familiar with. There's a lot of parallels here, that, where you're kind of considering these non-standard non-scientific explanations for experiences that people have and beliefs that they have. So I do think there is some expertise in philosophy to be helpful here. But yeah, I don't. I'm not claiming that I have any special expertise other than being able to kind of see how these things fit together and speculate. But philosophers like to speculate about all kinds of weird things, so there's lower risk for us doing that.
Yeah. It's kind of like perfect for somebody.
I think that's right.
To be able to like exercise the kind of tools in philosophy for thinking about some of these things, like you mentioned our philosophy of religion class.
Yeah.
It's like it's exactly the same ballpark. Like using those kinds of tools of critical thinking to speculate about things where the evidence is inconclusive.
Yeah, that's right. But that's kind of what philosophers do, right? Like we are used to, trained to try to think clearly about the fringes of our understanding of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gosh. Yeah. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what's coming.
It's going to be an interesting year. You and I should revisit this at the end of 2024.
Yes.
Assuming that our civilization hasn't collapsed by then.
I hope so. I hope not.
Here's hoping.
Yeah, if we're still standing.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we'll come back to this.
Yeah, we could meet among the rubble and have a debrief session.
We can do this on the same location, just in the rubble. The past buildings.
That's right. That'll be funny.
Well, thanks a lot for doing this again. I really appreciate it.
It's fun.
All right,
we did it.
Yes.
Sorry for my frog.
Oh no, it's fine. We like him.
It was funny.